In a world where humanity had turned its back on peace, gladiatorial games became the ultimate form of entertainment. People gathered in massive arenas, hungry not just for excitement, but for blood. These events were broadcast across cities, drawing millions of viewers who cheered as fighters battled beasts or each other for survival. It wasn't about fairness, it was about spectacle. And today the arena held something no one expected: a girl confined to a hover chair. Her name was Emily Carter. She wasn't like the others. While most contestants were hardened warriors or desperate volunteers trying to win freedom, Emily entered the arena because she had no choice. Her family owed an enormous debt to powerful corporate overlords, and they demanded payment in the cruelest way possible, sending Emily into the fight. Though she couldn't walk, she could still think, and thinking was all she had left. The arena was enormous, designed to intimidate anyone who dared step inside. Rows upon rows of seats stretched upward, packed with people shouting, laughing, and jeering at the fighters below. Giant screens hung overhead, showing close-ups of the competitors, faces capturing every flicker of fear or anger. Lights illuminated the sandy floor, casting long shadows that seemed alive. In one corner stood racks of weapons, swords, axes, and energy shields, all gleaming under the harsh glow. But none of those weapons belonged to Emily. Instead, she sat quietly in her hover chair, clutching the armrests tightly. Emily's hover chair wasn't built for battle. It was an old model, patched together after years of use. There were no spikes, no flamethrowers, nothing to protect her except thin metal plating. Around her, other contestants prepared themselves, strapping on armor and testing their weapons. Some glanced at her briefly before turning away, dismissing her as irrelevant. Others laughed openly, pointing at her chair and shaking their heads. One man, tall and broad-shouldered with scars running down his arms, walked over to her. His name was Jake Monroe, and he had a reputation for being ruthless. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, sneering. "You think this is some kind of joke? You can't even stand up." Emily didn't answer. She kept her gaze steady, looking straight ahead instead of meeting his eyes. Jake snorted and stepped back, muttering loud enough for others to hear. "They're letting cripples fight now? What's next? Babies?" The crowd roared with laughter, but Emily didn't flinch. She knew what they thought of her. She'd seen their faces when she first rolled into the arena. Pity, mockery, disbelief. All of it washed over her without touching her core. Deep down, she clung to a fragile hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to survive. Not for herself, but for her family. If she failed, they would suffer. That thought burned brighter than any weapon. While the other fighters busied themselves preparing for battle, Emily focused on something else entirely. Across the arena, behind thick glass walls, stood a creature unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was a stallion, wild and untamed, with muscles rippling beneath its dark coat. Its mane flowed like liquid shadow, and its eyes burned with intensity. This was Midnight, the beast everyone feared. Captured from the wilderness beyond civilization, Midnight was known for his ferocity. He hadn't been broken, not even by the harshest training methods. Rumors said he'd killed several handlers during transport. Now he paced back and forth in his enclosure, restless and alert. Emily watched him closely, studying his movements. Unlike the others, she didn't see Midnight as a monster. To her, he was a creature forced into captivity, much like herself. She wondered what it must feel like to be caged, unable to run free. As if sensing her gaze, Midnight stopped pacing and turned toward her. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Time seemed to slow as Emily held his stare, unblinking and calm. Midnight tilted his head slightly, curiosity replacing aggression. Then, as quickly as it began, the moment passed. Midnight resumed his pacing, but Emily felt something shift within her. Maybe there was more to this day than despair. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, pulling everyone's attention back to the present. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the greatest show on Earth." Cheers erupted from the crowd, drowning out everything else. Today we have a special lineup of fighters ready to give you the thrill of a lifetime. Among them, he paused dramatically, a new contender, Emily Carter. The crowd went wild, though not in the way Emily might have hoped. Boos mixed, with laughter creating a cacophony of noise. Someone threw a piece of trash onto the arena floor, narrowly missing her hover chair. Still, Emily remained still, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to look at the crowd to know what they thought of her. Weak, useless, a mistake. But she also knew better than to let their opinions define her. As the announcer continued describing the rules of the game, Emily tuned him out. She already understood the basics. Survive against whatever challenges came her way. Whether it was other fighters or beasts like Midnight, only one person would leave the arena alive. Everyone else would fall. Yet despite the odds stacked against her, Emily refused to give up. She had survived so much already. Accidents, surgeries, endless nights of pain. And she wasn't about to let this arena break her spirit. Around her, the other fighters grew restless, eager to prove themselves. They tested their weapons, flexed their muscles, and exchanged taunts. Jake smirked as he swung a heavy mace, clearly enjoying the attention. Others formed small groups, whispering strategies and eyeing Midnight's enclosure nervously. None of them paid Emily any mind. To them, she was invisible, a non-threat. But invisibility could be an advantage too. While they focused on brute force, Emily relied on something else entirely, her mind. She glanced at Midnight once more, feeling a strange connection to the stallion. Both of them were trapped in this place, forced to fight for reasons beyond their control. Yet neither of them looked defeated. Midnight's fiery spirit mirrored Emily's own determination. Together, perhaps they could defy the odds. The thought gave her strength, even as the gates began to open and the first wave of danger approached. Whatever happened next, Emily vowed to face it head-on, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The rules of survival were simple: stay alive. But in this arena, simplicity masked brutality. Each contestant faced two kinds of threats: other fighters and beasts unleashed into the arena. Among these beasts was Midnight, the untamed stallion, whose reputation preceded him. He wasn't just another challenge, he was a force of nature, capable of turning the tide of battle with a single charge. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena, explaining how Midnight would be released. Later, adding to the growing tension, Emily Carter listened carefully but didn't move. Her hover chair remained stationary as others dashed toward weapon racks scattered across the sandy floor. They grabbed swords, axes, shields, and even energy rifles, eager to arm themselves for the coming fight. Some contestants immediately began, forming alliances, whispering strategies, and pointing at potential targets. Others stood alone, their faces hard with determination. Jake Monroe, the largest and most intimidating fighter, claimed the biggest weapon, a massive mace that hummed with electrical energy. He swung it once, creating a crackling sound that made several nearby competitors flinch. Despite the flurry of activity around her, Emily stayed calm. She had no weapon, no armor, and no way to defend herself physically. Instead, she relied on something far more valuable: observation. While the others focused on arming themselves or sizing each other up, Emily studied every detail: the layout of the arena, the placement of obstacles, and most importantly, Midnight. Through the thick glass of his enclosure, she watched him pace back and forth, muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat. His movements were fluid yet powerful, and his eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Jake noticed Emily's stillness and sneered. "You think sitting there makes you brave?" he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're not even trying?" His words drew laughter from some of the other fighters, but Emily ignored him. She didn't need to prove anything to them. Instead, she turned her attention to Midnight again. There was something about the stallion that intrigued her. Despite his ferocity, she sensed a deeper emotion in him. Anger, yes, but also pain. Captivity must have been unbearable for such a free-spirited creature. As if sensing her thoughts, Midnight stopped pacing and looked directly at her. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Emily felt a strange connection. She wondered if he could sense her vulnerability too, or perhaps her quiet defiance. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier. The crowd roared with anticipation, chanting names and urging the fighters to begin. Some contestants couldn't wait any longer and charged at each other, swinging weapons wildly. Sparks flew as metal clashed against metal, and shouts of anger filled the air. One fighter fell after taking a blow to the head, his body crumpling onto the sand. Blood seeped into the ground, staining it crimson. The sight only fueled the crowd's excitement, their cheers growing louder. Emily remained untouched by the chaos. She maneuvered her hover chair slowly, positioning herself closer to the edge of the arena where fewer fighters lingered. From here she had a better view of both Midnight's enclosure and the main battlefield. Her strategy was clear: avoid direct confrontation and wait for the right moment to act. She knew she couldn't win through brute strength, so she had to rely on timing and precision. Every movement mattered, every decision counted. Midnight continued to watch her, his ears flicking forward whenever she moved. Occasionally he pawed at the ground, frustrated by the barrier between him and the outside world. Other fighters barely glanced at him, too focused on their own battles to worry about the stallion. But Emily understood that Midnight was the real wild card in this game. When he was released, everything would change. Until then, she needed to stay patient and alive. Jake eventually grew tired of taunting Emily and turned his attention to another opponent, a wiry man armed with twin daggers. Their fight was quick but brutal, ending when Jake slammed his mace into the man's chest, sending him sprawling onto the sand. The crowd erupted in applause, chanting Jake's name. He basked in the attention, flexing his muscles and raising his weapon triumphantly. Then, spotting Emily again, he smirked and pointed his mace in her direction. "Don't worry," he said loudly, addressing the audience. "I'll take care of her next. Can't let a cripple ruin the show, can we?" The crowd laughed, but Emily didn't react. She simply adjusted her position slightly, putting more distance between herself and Jake. She knew he wouldn't attack her immediately, not while there were stronger opponents to eliminate first. And until he did, she intended to use every second wisely. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the fights dragged on. More bodies littered the sand, and the remaining contestants grew increasingly desperate. Alliances broke apart, leaving individuals to fend for themselves. Some tried to retreat to safer areas of the arena, using crates and pillars as cover. Others launched reckless attacks, hoping to catch their enemies off guard. Amidst all this, Emily remained a constant presence, a quiet figure in a sea of chaos. Then came the announcement everyone had been waiting for. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves. It's time to unleash Midnight." The crowd went wild, stomping their feet and shouting with glee. A mechanical whirring sound signaled the opening of Midnight's enclosure. Slowly, the reinforced glass doors slid apart, revealing the stallion within. For a moment he hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously. Then, with a thunderous neigh, he burst into the arena, galloping at full speed. Pandemonium erupted. Fighters scrambled to get out of his path, but Midnight was faster than anyone expected. With a single charge, he bowled over two opponents, sending them flying across the sand. His hooves struck the ground with terrifying force, kicking up clouds of dust. The crowd screamed in delight, their cheers reaching a fever pitch. Blood splattered the arena floor as Midnight trampled one fighter who failed to dodge in time. Another tried to strike him with a sword, but Midnight reared up on his hind legs, delivering a crushing blow with his front hooves. Through it all, Emily stayed calm. She watched Midnight's every move, noting how he targeted those who attacked him first. He wasn't indiscriminately violent. He responded to threats with calculated precision. This realization gave her hope. If she could avoid provoking him, maybe she could survive his rampage. Carefully, she guided her hover chair away from the worst of the fighting, keeping a safe distance from both Midnight and the other fighters. Jake, however, saw an opportunity. Spotting Midnight distracted by another opponent, he raised his mace and charged toward the stallion, intent on landing a killing blow. But before he could reach him, Midnight spun around with lightning speed, his eyes blazing with fury. Jake froze mid-step, realizing too late that he'd underestimated the beast. Midnight lowered his head and charged, slamming into Jake with enough force to knock him off his feet. The mace flew from his grasp, skittering across the sand. For the first time since entering the arena, Emily allowed herself a small smile. Midnight wasn't just a mindless animal. He was intelligent, resourceful, and incredibly dangerous. And somehow she felt certain that he wouldn't harm her. As the chaos unfolded around her, she clung to that belief, knowing it might be the only thing keeping her alive. Midnight moved like a storm across the arena, his hooves pounding against the sandy ground with thunderous force. Fighters scrambled to escape his path, but he was too fast, too powerful. With each charge, he sent another opponent sprawling, their weapons useless against his sheer strength. Blood stained the sand as cries of pain echoed through the arena. The crowd roared louder with every blow, feeding off the chaos and destruction. Yet amidst the carnage, one figure remained untouched: Emily Carter. Emily sat quietly in her hover chair, watching Midnight with calm eyes. While others fled or fought back, she stayed still, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Midnight seemed aware of her presence, sparing her a glance whenever he passed nearby. It was almost as if he recognized her from earlier, the girl who had met his gaze without flinching. And now, in the midst of his rampage, he hesitated when he neared her. The first sign of something unusual came when Midnight approached Emily after trampling a fighter near her position. Instead of continuing his assault, he slowed down, his fiery eyes locking onto hers. The crowd fell silent, confused by the sudden change in pace. Fighters froze mid-battle, unsure what to make of this strange interaction. Even Jake Monroe, bruised and battered from his encounter with Midnight, stared in disbelief. Emily didn't move. She simply looked at Midnight, holding his gaze steadily. There was no fear in her expression, only quiet resolve. Slowly she raised a hand, not to defend herself, but to reach out toward him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The entire arena held its breath as Midnight lowered his head, sniffing the air around her. His nostrils flared and his ears twitched forward, curious rather than aggressive. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Midnight nudged her hand gently. The gesture was deliberate, almost tender. Emily's fingers brushed against his velvety nose, and she smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone," she murmured, though no one else could hear her words. Midnight stood still, allowing her touch, his massive frame towering over her fragile body. The contrast between them was striking, strength and vulnerability coming together in an unexpected bond. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, unable to believe what they were seeing. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the raw emotion unfolding before them. Others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about how such a thing could happen. The announcer, usually quick with commentary, struggled to find words. For once, even he was speechless. Jake Monroe, however, wasn't willing to accept this turn of events. Still reeling from his earlier defeat, he shouted angrily, pointing at Emily and Midnight. "This isn't fair. She's cheating somehow. That animal shouldn't be allowed to pick favorites." His protests drew scattered jeers from the crowd, but most people ignored him, captivated by the scene unfolding below. Midnight reacted instantly to Jake's outburst. He turned sharply, his ears flattening against his skull as he bared his teeth. A low growl rumbled deep in his throat, warning Jake to stay away. The message was clear. Emily was under his protection now. Jake took a step back, gripping the hilt of a discarded sword nervously. But before he could act, Midnight reared up on his hind legs, letting out a deafening neigh that echoed throughout the arena. The sound sent shivers down everyone's spines, including Jake's. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered under his breath, realizing he was outnumbered, not just by Midnight, but also by the tide of public opinion shifting against him. The crowd, which had once cheered for bloodshed, now rooted for Emily and her unlikely ally. Chants of her name began to rise, soft at first but growing louder with each repetition. "Emily! Emily!" they cried, their voices drowning out Jake's complaints. Emily felt the weight of their support pressing down on her shoulders. She hadn't expected this, not the bond with Midnight, not the crowd's reaction, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were still other fighters to contend with, and while Midnight protected her, she knew he couldn't fight forever. Sooner or later, the games would demand a victor, and Emily intended to ensure that victory belonged to her. With Midnight standing guard, Emily used her hover chair to maneuver cautiously around the arena. She avoided areas where remaining fighters lurked, steering clear of potential ambushes. Her movements were slow and deliberate, conserving energy while keeping an eye on both Midnight and her surroundings. Occasionally, Midnight followed her, lead trotting alongside her as if acknowledging their partnership. Together they formed an unstoppable team, one impossible to ignore. As the minutes ticked by, other fighters began to realize the futility of their efforts. Attacking Emily hard meant facing Midnight, and none of them wanted to test the stallion's wrath again. One by one they retreated, either surrendering outright or slinking into the shadows, hoping to avoid notice. The arena grew quieter, the sounds of battle replaced by the hum of anticipation. Only a handful of contestants remained, and among them, Jake Monroe refused to give up. Clutching his makeshift sword, Jake glared at Emily and Midnight, his pride wounded as much as his body. "Fine," he spat, raising his weapon defiantly. "If you want to play dirty, then let's finish this." He lunged forward, aiming not for Emily but for Midnight, hoping to incapacitate the stallion and break their alliance. But Midnight was ready. With a swift sidestep, he dodged Jake's attack and retaliated, slamming his shoulder into Jake's chest. The impact sent Jake flying backward, his sword skittering across the sand. Breathless and defeated, Jake collapsed onto the ground, clutching his ribs. He looked up at Midnight, hatred burning in his eyes, but he knew better than to try again. Defeated and humiliated, he raised his hands in surrender, signaling his withdrawal from the fight. The crowd booed loudly, unimpressed by his cowardice. Their attention returned to Emily and Midnight, the true center of the spectacle. Now only a few stragglers remained, too weak or injured to pose any real threat. Emily guided her hoverchair toward them, using her position wisely. Though she lacked physical strength, her strategic thinking gave her an edge. With Midnight at her side, she cornered the last fighters, forcing them to yield. One by one they dropped their weapons, bowing their heads in submission. By the time the final opponent surrendered, the arena was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic breathing of the stallion and the hum of the crowd. For the first time since entering the arena, Emily allowed herself a moment of relief. She glanced at Midnight, meeting his eyes once more. Though neither of them spoke, their bond was undeniable, a shared understanding forged in the heat of battle. Together they had defied the odds, proving that survival wasn't always about brute force. Sometimes it was about trust, courage, and the willingness to see beyond appearances. The judge's booth loomed above them, silent and unmoving. Everyone waited anxiously for their decision. Would they honor the rules and declare Emily the winner, or would they punish her for breaking tradition? As the seconds stretched into minutes, Emily kept her gaze steady, refusing to show weakness. Whatever happened next, she knew she had already won something far greater than freedom. Respect, for herself, for Midnight, and for the power of compassion in a brutal world. The silence in the arena was deafening. Everyone waited for the judge's decision, their eyes fixed on the booth high above the battlefield. Emily sat calmly in her hover chair, her hand still resting lightly on Midnight's mane. The stallion stood tall beside her, his chest rising and falling steadily as he surveyed the scene around them. Together they formed an unbreakable pair, a symbol of defiance against the cruelty that had defined these games for so long. The crowd, once eager for bloodshed, now seemed transformed. Many spectators dabbed at their eyes with tissues, overcome by emotion. Others leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another about what they had just witnessed. Some even chanted Emily's name again, their voices softer, but filled with admiration. It was clear that something profound had shifted, not just in the arena but in the hearts of those watching. Jake Monroe, humiliated and battered, lay sprawled on the sand several feet away. He glared at Emily and Midnight, his jaw clenched, tightly. Though he hadn't surrendered officially, his defeat was undeniable. His weapon lay useless beside him, and his body ached too much to move. For the first time in his life, Jake felt powerless, unable to rely on brute strength or intimidation. He hated it, but more than that, he hated how the crowd had turned against him. They no longer cheered for violence, instead they celebrated kindness and courage. Other fighters who remained in the arena were either injured or too exhausted to continue fighting. Some knelt on the ground, heads bowed in defeat, while others simply stared at Emily and Midnight in awe. None of them dared to challenge the duo. Midnight's presence alone was enough to deter any further aggression. His fierce loyalty to Emily was evident, and anyone foolish enough to attack her would face the full force of his wrath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the head judge stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice rang out through the speakers, clear and authoritative. "Contestants, the final verdict has been reached." He paused dramatically, scanning the arena before continuing. "In accordance with the rules of combat, and considering the extraordinary circumstances, we declare Emily Carter the winner of today's match." The announcement ignited a wave of cheers from the audience. People leapt to their feet, applauding wildly as if celebrating a historic victory. The chant of "Emily, Emily" echoed throughout the arena, louder and more passionate than ever before. Even some of the defeated fighters joined in, nodding respectfully toward her. It wasn't just her survival that earned their admiration, it was the way she had done it. She hadn't relied on weapons or violence. Instead, she had shown compassion, intelligence, and bravery. Emily exhaled deeply, relief washing over her. She glanced up at the judge's booth, then back at Midnight. The stallion nudged her shoulder gently as if sharing in her joy. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the feeling of triumph. She had entered the arena broken and afraid, but she was leaving it stronger. Not because she had fought, but because she had connected. Her bond with Midnight had changed everything. But the celebration didn't end there. As the judges prepared to escort Emily out of the arena, one of them announced another decision. "In light of today's events," he said, his tone softer now, "we have also determined that Midnight shall not return to captivity. Instead, he will be granted freedom, alongside Emily Carter." The crowd erupted into applause once again, this time accompanied by whistles and shouts of approval. Freedom for Midnight was a fitting conclusion to the day's events. After all, he had proven himself to be more than just a beast. He was a creature of spirit and heart, deserving of respect. Emily's eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to look at Midnight, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, though only Midnight could hear her. She reached up to stroke his mane again, her touch gentle and reassuring. Midnight responded by lowering his head slightly, almost bowing to her. The gesture brought fresh tears to the eyes of many in the audience. Even the hardest-hearted spectators found themselves moved by the depth of the connection between human and animal. As the arena staff began clearing away debris and tending to the wounded, Emily guided her hoverchair toward the exit, with Midnight walking proudly beside her. The crowd parted to let them pass, forming a pathway lined with cheers and applause. Some people threw flowers onto the sand, creating a colorful trail for Emily and Midnight to follow. Others held up signs bearing messages like "Hope lives" and "Freedom wins," inspired by the unlikely pair's journey. Outside the arena, the world felt different. The bright sunlight stung Emily's eyes after hours spent under artificial lights, but she welcomed it. Fresh air filled her lungs, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the arena. Midnight stepped cautiously onto the pavement, his hooves clicking softly against the hard surface. He looked around curiously, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. For the first time in months, or perhaps years, he was truly free. Emily stopped her hover chair near a wide-open field just beyond the arena complex. She turned to face Midnight, her heart swelling with emotion. "You're free now," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You don't have to fight anymore. You can go wherever you want." Midnight tilted his head, studying her carefully. Then, to her astonishment, he nuzzled her cheek affectionately. It was as if he understood her words and chose to stay close, at least for now. Emily smiled through her tears, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the bond they shared. She knew that Midnight could run off at any moment, disappearing into the wilderness where he belonged. But for now, he remained by her side, a silent guardian and friend. News of Emily's victory spread quickly, reaching far beyond the confines of the arena. Reporters swarmed the area, desperate to capture interviews and footage of the girl who had tamed a wild stallion. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in her direction, and questions flew at her from every angle. Yet Emily handled it all with grace, speaking honestly about her experience without boasting or seeking fame. When asked about Midnight, she simply said, "He taught me that strength isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about trust." Her words resonated with people across the globe. Videos of her interaction with Midnight went viral, sparking conversations about compassion, resilience, and the value of seeing beyond appearances. In a world obsessed with violence and spectacle, Emily and Midnight reminded everyone of the power of empathy. Their story became a beacon of hope, inspiring countless others to believe in the possibility of change, even in the darkest of times. For Emily, the days that followed were surreal. She returned home to find her family waiting for her, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced her. The debt they owed had been forgiven as part of her prize, freeing them from the grip of corporate overlords. Though her legs remained paralyzed, Emily carried herself differently now, with confidence and purpose. She realized that her disability did not define her courage and determination did. As for Midnight, he eventually disappeared into the wilderness, galloping across open fields and leaping over streams. But Emily never forgot him, and she liked to think that he remembered her too. On quiet nights, she would sit outside and gaze at the horizon, imagining him running free under the stars. She knew that their paths might never cross again, but the bond they had shared would stay with her forever. Emily's journey had begun in despair, but it ended in triumph, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed her story. She had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, proving that even in a brutal world, kindness could shine brightest. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that she had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because she had already conquered the greatest battle of all, the one within herself. The days following Emily's victory felt like a dream. For the first time in years, she woke up without fear looming over her. The debt that had haunted her family was gone, erased as part of her prize for surviving the arena. She no longer had to worry about corporate overlords or threats of punishment, but more importantly, she carried something far greater within her, a sense of purpose. Emily spent her mornings outside, sitting in her hover chair near the edge of an open field just beyond the city limits. It was here that Midnight had chosen to take his first steps into freedom. Though he had disappeared into the wilderness days ago, Emily often came to this spot, hoping to catch a glimpse of him running free. Sometimes, she imagined she could hear his hooves pounding against the earth or see his dark silhouette racing across the horizon. Whether real or imagined, these moments brought her comfort. Her family noticed the change in her almost immediately. Before entering the arena, Emily had been quiet and withdrawn, weighed down by her circumstances. Now she spoke openly about her experiences, sharing stories of Midnight and the lessons she had learned. Her younger brother, Daniel, listened, intently, his eyes wide with admiration. "You're like a hero," he said one evening during dinner. Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm not a hero," she replied. "I was just brave enough to trust someone or something when I had no other choice." Her words stayed with Daniel long after the meal ended. He began drawing pictures of Emily and Midnight, filling pages with images of the stallion rearing up beside her hover chair. When Emily saw the drawings, she smiled, touched by her brother's creativity. For the first time in years, their home felt lighter, filled with laughter instead of worry. News of Emily's story continued to spread, reaching audiences far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Reporters visited her house daily, eager to capture interviews and photographs. At first, Emily found it overwhelming, but she soon realized the impact her story could have. People around the world were inspired by her courage and compassion. Messages poured in from strangers who thanked her for reminding them of the power of kindness in a harsh world. Some shared their own struggles, while others expressed hope for a brighter future. One day, a filmmaker approached Emily with an idea: to turn her journey into a documentary. "Your story isn't just about survival," he explained. "It's about connection, empathy, and breaking free from the things that hold us back. That's something everyone needs to hear." After some thought, Emily agreed. She hoped that by sharing her experience, she could inspire others to face their own battles with courage and grace. Filming began shortly afterward, with cameras capturing Emily's daily life and reflections on her time in the arena. The crew followed her to the field where Midnight had run free, filming her as she spoke about the bond they had formed. "Midnight wasn't just a beast," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "He was a mirror reflecting my own fears and strengths. When I looked at him, I saw myself, trapped but determined to break free." The filmmakers also interviewed members of the crowd who had witnessed the event firsthand. Many recounted how Emily's calm demeanor and Midnight's protective stance had moved them to tears. "It wasn't just a fight," one woman said, her eyes shining with emotion. "It was a reminder that we're all capable of finding light, even in the darkest places." As the documentary took shape, Emily's fame grew, but she remained grounded. She refused to let the attention define her, focusing instead on helping others. Inspired by her experience, she started working with organizations that supported people with disabilities, advocating for accessibility and inclusion. She also partnered with animal rights groups, raising awareness about the treatment of creatures like Midnight, those forced into captivity and exploited for entertainment. Meanwhile, Midnight became a legend in his own right. Stories of the wild stallion who had defied the arena spread among rural communities near the wilderness. Farmers claimed to have spotted him galloping through fields at dawn, his mane flowing like smoke in the early light. Children whispered tales of a mysterious horse who protected lost travelers and frightened away predators. No one knew for sure if these stories were true, but they added to Midnight's mystique, turning him into a symbol of freedom and resilience. Though Emily missed Midnight deeply, she understood why he had left. His spirit belonged to the wild, and she respected his decision to return to nature. Still, she couldn't help but wonder if he ever thought of her. On quiet nights, she would sit outside and gaze at the stars, imagining him doing the same somewhere far away. She liked to believe that their bond transcended distance, that somehow they remained connected despite being apart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily decided to visit the field one last time before winter set in. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry leaves and cool earth. She parked her hover home. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Emily sat quietly atop a small hill in her hover chair, her eyes scanning the endless expanse of open field before her. This was her favorite place, the ideal spot where Midnight had first tasted freedom. She came here often, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature and the memories it held. Today felt different, though, as if the universe itself knew something significant was about to happen. As she watched the horizon, a flicker of movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be her imagination playing tricks again. But then, unmistakably, a dark figure emerged from the distance. It was Midnight. He moved slowly at first, his powerful strides carrying him across the field with effortless grace. His coat shimmered in the fading sunlight, and his mane flowed like liquid shadow behind him. For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest as tears welled up in her eyes. Midnight stopped several feet away, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. His fiery eyes softened when they met hers, and he let out a low whinny that carried through the stillness of the evening. Emily smiled, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," she admitted softly. "But I hoped." For a long while, neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other, their bond transcending words. Then, slowly, Midnight approached her, his hooves making soft sounds against the earth. He lowered his head until his nose brushed against her hand, just as it had in the arena. Emily stroked his velvety muzzle, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved me in more ways than one." Midnight nudged her gently, as if acknowledging her gratitude. There was no need for explanations. They both understood what this moment meant. It was a goodbye, but not an end. Their connection would always remain etched into their hearts forever. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Go on," she said finally, her tone bittersweet. "You belong out here. You're free now." Midnight hesitated, his ears flicking forward as if questioning her words. But then, after a long pause, he stepped back and turned toward the horizon. With one last glance over his shoulder, he broke into a gallop, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly across the field. Emily watched him go, her tears streaming freely now. She didn't call him back. Instead, she let him run, knowing that this was what he needed, to embrace the wildness within him. As Midnight disappeared into the distance, Emily felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because their time together was truly over, but relief because she knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. She stayed there for a while longer, watching the sun dip below the horizon and the stars begin to twinkle in the sky. The world seemed quieter now, yet full of promise. When she finally returned home, Emily found her family waiting for her. They greeted her warmly, sensing the weight of the emotions she carried. Daniel ran up to her, holding out a new drawing he had made, a picture of Emily and Midnight standing side by side under a starry sky. "This is how I'll always remember him," he said proudly. Emily hugged him tightly, touched by his innocence and love. Life continued to change for Emily, in unexpected ways. The documentary about her journey premiered to widespread acclaim, touching millions of lives around the globe. Viewers were inspired by her story of resilience and compassion, and many reached out to share how it had impacted them. Some wrote letters thanking her for giving them hope during difficult times. Others shared their own stories of overcoming adversity. Emily read every message, humbled by the knowledge that her experience had resonated so deeply with others. Her advocacy work flourished as well. She became a prominent voice for people with disabilities, speaking at conferences and collaborating with organizations to improve accessibility and inclusion. She also worked tirelessly to promote animal rights, ensuring that creatures like Midnight were treated with dignity and respect. Her efforts earned her recognition and awards, but none of that mattered to her as much as the difference she was making in the world. One day, while attending a charity event, Emily met a young girl named Lily who reminded her of herself. Lily used a wheelchair and struggled with self-confidence, unsure of her place in the world. Emily spent hours talking to her, sharing her experiences and encouraging her to believe in her own strength. By the end of their conversation, Lily's eyes sparkled with newfound determination. "If you can do it," she said shyly, "then maybe I can too." Those words stayed with Emily long after the event ended. They reminded her of why she kept pushing forward, because her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who needed a little hope, a little courage, or a reminder that they weren't alone. Years passed, and Emily's life continued to evolve. She traveled the world, spreading her message of kindness and resilience wherever she went. Though she never saw Midnight again, she often dreamed of him running free beneath the stars, untamed and unbroken. Those dreams brought her peace, reminding her that some bonds are eternal, even if they exist only in memory. On clear nights, Emily would sit outside and gaze at the constellations, imagining midnight somewhere out there, racing across fields, and leaping over streams. She liked to think that he was happy, living the life he was born to live. And whenever she felt overwhelmed by the challenges of her own life, she would close her eyes and picture him, the wild stallion who had taught her that true strength lies not in power, but in connection. In the end, Emily realized that her journey had been about more than survival. It had been about finding light in the darkness, forging connections that transcended barriers, and proving that even in a brutal world, compassion could shine brightest. As she looked toward the future, she knew she would carry those lessons with her always, along with the memory of a wild stallion who had changed her life forever.